The air in the squad car hung thick with the metallic scent of lukewarm coffee and the stale humidity of a late summer night in Redwood County. Officer Jax Keller, a man whose youthful face was already etched with the deep, tired lines of a 3-year veteran, tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. His partner, Detective Lee Hansen, a veteran whose calm exterior hid a mind sharper than a freshly honed surgical steel knife, stared out the passenger window at the black wall of the surrounding forest. Another night, another 100 square miles of nothing, Jax muttered, adjusting his collar. Lee didn't look away from the pines. It's not nothing, Jax. It's the place where the nothing starts. That's a whole different kind of busy. Their patrol route skirted the edge of the Pine Barrens, a vast, unnerving stretch of wilderness that the locals swore swallowed more than just sunlight. It was 3:17 a.m. The kind of hour where the world forgets it has a human audience. That's when the radio crackled, not the usual static-laced squawk from the dispatcher, but a sudden, piercing tone. It wasn't a standard alarm or a distress signal. It sounded like an emergency broadcast system test had gone rogue, but layered beneath the mechanical wail was something else, a distorted, high-pitched singing. Lee leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Redwood, what the hell is that signal? The dispatcher's voice, usually cool and professional, was strained. 507, 509, that's a black box call. It's coming from the abandoned Harrow Creek Sanitarium on Route 17. Automatic system. No live caller. We haven't had that thing trip in 20 years. Get out there. Discreetly. A black box call. Jack swallowed. It was local jargon for a silent, coded alarm linked directly to the oldest, most derelict locations in the county, places where, for insurance and liability reasons, a regular phone line was a liability. Harrow Creek was the worst of them. Closed down in the late 60s after a brutal, unsolved incident involving a mass casualty event and staff disappearances, it was a local legend, the place where the wind always sounded like weeping. Harrow Creek? Seriously? Why is there even a live line there? Jax asked, his voice a little too high. Apparently, the system maintenance was overlooked, Lee said, already pulling up the map on the dash. Her composure was unsettling. Discreetly means no lights, no siren. Let's not wake up the ghosts, Keller. As they drove deeper, the woods closed in. The singing on the radio got louder, cutting through the police band noise. It was a bizarre chorus, high and shimmering, almost like a choir of children singing a nursery rhyme in reverse, the melody constantly folding in on itself. Jax felt a pressure behind his eyes, a phantom vibration in his teeth. When they arrived, the sanitarium was a monolithic ruin of crumbling brick and shattered glass, an open tomb under the cold glow of a half-moon. The air here was colder, dead even in the summer heat. The only light was their headlights cutting twin swathes into the overgrown driveway. Lee grabbed her heavy-duty flashlight and a spare battery. Stay sharp, Jax. If that singing is coming from inside, we're going to find a broken speaker, a prankster, or, she paused, looking up at the hundreds of dark, empty windows, or something we can't write on a police report. The front entrance was sealed with a rusted chain. Lee produced a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters from the trunk. As the chain snapped with a sickening crack, the singing on the radio, which they had left on a low volume, stopped. Utter silence fell, heavier than the structure itself. They exchanged a look, the tension immediate and suffocating. It cut out the second we broke the seal, Jax whispered. Lee simply nodded, her hand already moving to the butt of her service weapon. Her flashlight beam pierced the gloom of the lobby, illuminating peeling paint, collapsed ceiling tiles, and a single, ancient, overturned wheelchair. Let's find the black box panel, she said, her voice a low, steady command that barely broke the silence. The emergency system is usually in the administrative wing, first floor. And watch your step. I have a very bad feeling about the plumbing in this place. As they stepped across the threshold, Jax felt an involuntary shiver race down his spine. The cold wasn't just physical. It was a cold that seemed to come from the absence of warmth, of life, of everything. And he could swear, just at the edge of his hearing, a faint, almost imperceptible echo of the high, warped singing was beginning again, not from the radio, but from somewhere deep inside the walls. This time, it didn't sound like a choir. It sounded like a single, distant voice, calling their names. The interior of Harrow Creek swallowed the light from their powerful flashlights, leaving behind more shadow than it consumed. Every footstep echoed with a horrifying finality on the debris-strewn tile floor. The air was thick with the dust of ages, decay, and a faint, sweet smell that Jax couldn't quite place, something like ozone mixed with old flowers. They moved toward the administrative wing, following the faint, corroded signs. The silence was absolute, save for the crunch of broken glass and plaster beneath their boots. The high-pitched singing from the radio was gone, but the strange, internal echo Jax had heard in the wall was now undeniable. It was rhythmic, almost like a faint, distant heartbeat, thrumming from the deeper levels of the structure. Hear that? Jax whispered, his hand instinctively resting on his sidearm. Lee's beam swept over a wall covered in decades-old graffiti, mostly names and dates, but one crude drawing stood out, a stick figure with wide, staring eyes and an unnaturally long neck, its mouth open in a soundless scream. The pipes, Lee murmured, dismissing the noise, though her jaw was tight. Old structures, Jax. They breathe. Let's focus on the panel. Get us out of here. The administrative office was a wide, high-ceilinged room that had been ransacked long ago. Desks were overturned, filing cabinets lay on their sides like metal coffins, and stacks of water-damaged paper formed macabre, fungal monuments on the floor. Lee found the black box alarm panel, a dusty, beige metal box, high up near the remnants of a ceiling fan. She climbed carefully onto a surprisingly sturdy desk to inspect it. The box was humming faintly. The alarm tripped, she announced, dusting off the cover. Circuitry's ancient, but the power light is steady green. The log should tell us what the trigger was. Jax stood guard, his light moving restlessly around the large room. That strange, sweet smell was stronger here. He aimed his light at the overturned filing cabinets. He caught a flash of white amidst the chaos. Detective, look at this, he said, pulling out a thick, water-stained file labeled Patient 734, Reichenbach, ISLA. Lee jumped down quickly, her attention diverted from the black box. The county ordered all patient records destroyed in 71. This shouldn't be here. The file was brittle and nearly fused together by time and mold. They managed to carefully pry open a few pages. Jax's beam fell on a faded intake photo, a young woman, perhaps 19, with wide, terrified eyes and hair like spun silver. The notes, scribbled in frantic cursive, were nearly illegible, but a few phrases stood out. The subject exhibits extreme auditory sensitivity. Claims the walls are singing to her. Not hallucinations. She attempts to join the choir, unresponsive to medication. The sound is constant. She describes the tone as pure frequency, the sound of the world ending quietly. Has carved symbols into her skin, and finally, stamped across the last page, the bold red ink of a physician's note, transferred, deep isolation. The date was October 12, 1967, the week before the infamous closure. Deep isolation? Jax read aloud, the phrase chilling him. Lee's eyes were fixed on the photo of Isla. That's the subterranean ward, Jax. The tunnels. They sealed them off decades ago. This girl, Isla, she was here right before everything went south. She looked back at the black box alarm. The system tripped. And the last person to occupy the facility before its closure was someone who claimed the building was singing. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the floor directly above them. It was a heavy, metallic sound, like a dumpster lid being dropped from a height, instantly shattering the tenuous silence. Lee reacted instantly, pulling her service weapon and leveling it at the ceiling. Jax followed suit. We're not alone, Lee hissed, her voice low and focused. It's not the plumbing. Black box panel is compromised. We need to leave. Now. But Jax was looking at the patient file in his hand. Wait, detective. The black box wasn't triggered by the plumbing. Look. He pointed his beam at a single, meticulously preserved piece of paper wedged deep inside Isla's file, a piece of sheet music. It wasn't standard notation. The notes were tiny, densely packed symbols, a complex, swirling pattern that looked less like a melody and more like a mathematical equation of sound. Lee snatched it. As her eyes scanned the unsettling music, a low, drawn-out sound drifted down from the floor above, a chilling, almost mechanical hum. It wasn't the singing. It was the sound of something heavy being slowly, meticulously dragged across the wooden floor directly over their heads. "Let's go, Jax," Lee commanded, moving towards the exit, her flashlight beam frantic. "We are not investigating a robbery." As they sprinted toward the door, Jax glanced back at the open filing cabinet. He swore he saw a thin line of dark liquid, thick as oil, slowly weeping from the cabinet labeled Patient 734, tracing a path down to the dusty floor. It smelled faintly of that sweet, strange ozone. They burst out of the administrative wing and into the main hall. The dragging sound from upstairs abruptly ceased, replaced by a swift, rhythmic thump-thump-thump as something large began to descend the main staircase, something moving with an impossible, heavy speed. Lee and Jax flattened themselves behind a massive, collapsed pillar. The sound grew deafening. "Don't look at it, Jax. Just listen." Lee breathed, her gun steady, her flashlight off. The unseen entity reached the ground floor. Its sound changed, no longer dragging, but a moist, heavy shuffling, interspersed with sickening, wet slaps against the tile. The sound circled their position, agonizingly slow, testing the perimeter of their fear. Then, from the darkness just 20 feet away, the creature let out a sound, not a growl, but a sharp, wet exhalation, followed by a single, distinct, rhythmic click. It was the sound of a tongue against teeth, the sound a human makes when they are trying to clear their throat before speaking, and then, a voice that was low, resonant, and impossibly, sickeningly sweet, spoke clearly in the oppressive darkness. 507. 509. You answered the call. The voice was the hook. It had the smooth, cultured tone of a highly educated man, overlaid with a wet, viscous texture that suggested the speaker hadn't used their vocal cords normally in a very long time. Lee's eyes darted through the gloom. "Show yourself," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in Jax's hand. A sound of wet movement answered her, not footsteps, but the dragging of something heavy and low, scraping closer. Jax could smell it now, overwhelming the ozone and decay, a horrific, metallic odor, like a slaughterhouse mixed with industrial-strength disinfectant. "We don't need to see each other, Detective Hansen," the voice replied, closer still, the sweetness curdling into something malicious. "The call was for the choir director. Not the singers." "How do you know my name?" Lee demanded, easing the hammer back on her weapon, the click sounding like a thunderclap in the vast, dark hall. A low, resonant chuckle filled the space. "It's all on file, Detective. In the administrative wing. The details are always so important. Just like Isla Reichenbach's sheet music." The mention of the file sent a jolt of ice through Jax. They had just been holding that file. Was this thing reading the records they had exposed? Lee didn't hesitate. "Jax. Flash on. Now." They simultaneously flicked on their high-powered beams, blasting the surrounding darkness. The light fell on a horrific sight, 20 feet away, near the main staircase. It wasn't AMAN. It was a vast, pulsating mass of something that defied description, a knot of pale, hairless flesh that seemed to be comprised of several human forms fused together. It was roughly the height of a man but impossibly wide, draped in shreds of what looked like long disintegrated orderlies' uniforms. Its most disturbing feature was its head, or rather, the collection of heads, 3 human craniums, pale and eyeless, mashed together at the back, facing away from them. The voice seemed to emanate from a single, distended orifice on the thing's chest, a mouth-like slit lined with glistening, pink tissue. As the light hit it, the entity didn't recoil. Instead, it slowly lifted an appendage, an arm of impossibly long, pale bone, tipped with 3 razor-sharp, claw-like fingers. It pointed, not at them. At the floor. "The source," the voice sighed, almost serenely, "is in the echo chamber." Lee didn't wait for another word. "Back up, Jax. Slow. Don't take your eyes off it." They retreated toward the entrance, but the entity moved with a sudden, impossible burst of speed, not running, but a disgusting, silent slide across the floor, cutting off their escape. "You break the chain," the voice stated, the sweetness gone, replaced by a low growl. "You answer the call. The frequency is set. The door is open. It raised the clawed arm again, pointing now not at them, but past them, toward a sealed-off section of the main hall they hadn't noticed, a heavy steel door with a rusted latch, marked with a faded, hand-painted sign, Deep Isolation Ward. Staff only. Jax realized the gravity of their mistake. They hadn't come to stop a prank. They had come to release something. The black box call wasn't a cry for help, it was a lure. "We need to go, Lee!" Jax yelled, adrenaline flooding his system. He raised his gun and fired 3 rounds in quick succession at the entity's central mass. The bullets hit with a sickening thud but had no immediate visible effect. The entity merely shuddered, and a thin, dark liquid, like the oil from the patient file, seeped from the entry wounds. "Rude," the voice whispered, and the creature launched itself forward. Lee shoved Jax aside, firing her own weapon, aiming for the chest mouth. Her shots were closer together, more accurate, but still the creature lumbered on. "The door, Jax. We need to get into the isolation ward. It wants us to go there." Lee shouted, realizing the terrible logic. The entity was blocking the exit, forcing them deeper. They spun around and charged at the steel door. Jax brought his shoulder down on the latch, which bent with a groan of stressed metal. Lee slammed her boot against the weakened steel, and the latch finally failed, the door scraping open a crack, revealing a staircase leading down into utter blackness. Just as they slipped through, the creature reached the door, its clawed hand slamming against the steel, buckling the metal inward with frightening force. They tumbled down a short, spiral staircase into a new environment, the subterranean ward. The air here was damp and smelled powerfully of concrete, chemicals, and something that made Jax's stomach churn, a sour, organic musk. The staircase ended in a long, narrow corridor of bare, wet concrete. It was silent here. Too silent. Lee shone her light down the corridor. It was lined with heavy, solid steel doors, the isolation rooms. They were all closed, all bolted from the outside. "This is it. Deep isolation," Lee muttered, checking the magazine in her weapon. Suddenly, a new sound began, echoing off the damp concrete walls of the tunnel. It was the singing again, but this time, it was loud, vibrant, and incredibly pure, emanating from the depths of the corridor. It wasn't distorted by a radio or a wall. It was the clear, soaring voice of a soprano, a melody that sounded celestial, beautiful, and profoundly wrong. Jax felt the pressure in his head return, stronger this time. It wasn't just auditory, it was physical, a vibration that resonated deep within his bones. "The sheet music," Lee said, her voice shaking slightly, her eyes wide. "Jax, that melody, it matches the notes on Isla's file." As the singing reached a high, crystalline crescendo, the heavy steel door locks along the corridor began to grind, slowly, deliberately. One after another, the bolts were being drawn back. Jax stared down the corridor as the first door, the one at the furthest end, slowly, inexorably, began to open. "We need to stop that," Jax gasped, clutching his head. "It's the frequency. It's unlocking them." But as the singing reached its peak, the steel door they had just come through, the entrance to the ward, slammed shut with a sound that shook the foundation of the building. The latch bolted into place, they were sealed in, and from the now open isolation room at the end of the hall, a figure slowly stepped out into the faint pool of their flashlight beam. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in a white, tattered gown. It was Isla Reichenbach, 30 years older, but with the same silver hair and wide, terrified eyes that were now staring not at them, but up at the concrete ceiling, lost in the sound of her own terrible song. Isla Reichenbach stood at the far end of the narrow concrete corridor, completely unresponsive to the blinding glare of their tactical flashlights. Her face was gaunt, the skin pale and almost translucent, but the energy of her voice, the source of the pure, soaring soprano, was immense. The air thrummed with the music, an unbearable vibrational pressure that made Jax want to scream. Lee raised her weapon, aiming directly at the center of the figure. "Isla! Stop singing! Police! Get on the ground!" Isla didn't react to the command, but the beautiful melody faltered, replaced by a momentary, painful gasp that sounded like a dry intake of breath. The second that gasp occurred, the high-frequency pressure in Jax's head dropped, and he found he could breathe again. the creature from the lobby, the one with the fused bodies, had called Isla the choir director. The singing was the key. Lee seized the moment of silence. Jax, the music. She's controlling the environment with the sound. If she stops, the locks hold. But the gasp was brief. Isla immediately drew in another, impossibly deep breath, and the pure, vibrating melody started again, stronger this time, the notes slightly lower, richer, and more complex. This new, deeper frequency was worse. It didn't just vibrate in their heads, it resonated with the steel of the locked cell doors. With a sickening, metallic shriek, for more isolation, doors down the corridor simultaneously burst open. The ward was no longer silent. From the newly opened cells, 4 new figures emerged, shuffling and swaying. They were also cadaverously thin, draped in tattered hospital gowns, their faces obscured by long, matted hair. Unlike Isla, who was focused on the ceiling, these 4 figures turned their heads toward Lee and Jax with unsettling synchronization. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets on tangled strings. They were the choir. And they were facing the audience. "Backup is not coming, Jax," Lee stated grimly, her light fixed on the advancing figures. "That singing is probably jamming our comms. We fight our way through, or we don't leave." The 4 singers began to move down the corridor, their shuffling gait quickly turning into a low, predatory crouch. They were silent, their movements unnerving in their coordination, but Jax realized they were moving perfectly in time with Isla's distant, soaring melody. "They're moving to the music," Jax shouted over the pounding in his ears. "It's conducting them." Lee fired 2 quick shots at the leading figure. The bullet struck the creature's chest, throwing it backward with force, but it didn't slow down. It hit the wall with a sickening wet thud and immediately scrambled back up, faster than before. "Blanks!" Lee cursed. "It's too damaged, or too, something. It's not stopping them." They were rapidly running out of space to maneuver. The 4 entities were now only 30 feet away, and as they closed in, the intense, sweet scent of ozone and decay was overpowering. Jax noticed a small, narrow alcove, a storage closet, judging by the heavily bolted wooden door, to their left. "The closet! We need cover." They scrambled toward it, but as they did, the figure of Isla Reichenbach raised her impossibly long, pale arm and brought it down sharply, like a conductor finishing a grand movement. The singing ceased, the silence was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the pressure from the room. Jax gasped for air, his ears ringing violently. The 4 approaching figures instantly froze, mid-stride, their heads tilted slightly, awaiting the next note. Lee and Jax reached the closet door and struggled with the ancient bolts. Then, from the darkness of the administrative wing above them, the deep, viscous voice of the multi-fused entity boomed down the closed ventilation shaft, its tone rich with amusement. "The choir is waiting for the next movement, detective. And I am quite impatient to see who will join the soprano." The entity had followed them. And it was communicating with Isla. Isla, eyes still fixed on the ceiling, slowly brought her hands together, palm to palm, like a concert pianist preparing to strike a chord. She opened her mouth and began to produce a low, sustained trill, a high-frequency vibration that was less song and more pure sonic weapon. The sound hammered Jax's eardrums, and he saw the concrete wall beside him begin to microfracture, tiny dust motes raining down. The 4 figures started moving again, their silent, shuffling pace quickening into a terrifying run. "Now, Jax. Break the lock!" Lee yelled, aiming her gun at the bolt on the wooden door. Jax fired a shot at the heavy bolt, trying to shatter the mechanism. The bullet struck metal, sparking uselessly. The wood was far thicker than it looked. As the creatures closed to within 10 feet, Lee spotted a corroded fire extinguisher hanging nearby. Without hesitation, she ripped it from the wall and swung it, connecting with a sickening crunch against the head of the nearest creature. The creature collapsed in a heap of white gown and pale flesh, momentarily stunned, but Isla's trill was intensifying. Jax felt a sudden, sharp pop in his left ear. He was dizzy and disoriented, his vision swimming. Lee slammed her shoulder into the wooden door while Jax kicked at the lock again. Finally, the rotten wood around the bolt split with a sharp tear. They burst through, falling into a tiny, claustrophobic room packed with rusted shelves and boxes of chemical powders. They slammed the wooden door shut and threw themselves against the flimsy barrier, through the thin wood, they could hear the four silent figures slamming into the door, not with random desperation, but with a terrifying, rhythmic thud-thud-thud, perfectly timed to the relentless, high-frequency trill coming from Isla. Lee struggled to throw the heavy, interior steel latch. "We bought 10 seconds, Jax. We need to find another way out, now. We can't stay on the same frequency as them." Jax shook his head, clearing his ringing ears. He shone his light on the storage room. It was tiny, mostly filled with chemicals and surgical instruments, but in the back corner, concealed by a stack of thick, ancient burlap sacks, he saw it, a small, circular, heavily sealed manhole cover, sunk into the concrete floor. It was their last chance. The relentless, rhythmic pounding on the flimsy wooden door was punctuated by Isla's high-frequency trill, which now felt less like a sound and more like a physical beating. The steel latch on the inside was flimsy, bending under the stress of the synchronized attacks from the four entities outside. "The manhole, Jax! Get the sacks clear!" Lee yelled, drawing her flashlight to aim its powerful beam on the rusted circular cover. Jax shoved the burlap sacks aside, revealing the heavy, cast-iron cover. It had 4 massive bolts, seized with decades of rust. The metallic smell in the room, a mix of cleaning agents and decay, was intensely strong here. Lee saw a rusted, heavy-duty pipe wrench lying forgotten on a shelf. "Wrench! Now!" The moment she grabbed the wrench, the wooden door splintered with a sickening crack, and a pale, clawed hand punched through the wood, scrabbling wildly for purchase. Lee brought the wrench down with a deafening clang on the invading limb, and the hand was instantly withdrawn with a moist, snapping sound. The rhythmic pounding outside momentarily ceased. Isla's trill also seemed to waver, as if the pain had briefly broken her concentration. "Now or never." Lee grunted, handing the wrench to Jax. Jax jammed the wrench onto the first bolt. The metal screamed in protest, but the bolt refused to turn. He threw his entire weight onto the handle, using the momentum of the rhythmic thudding from outside to time his efforts. Thud-thud crank. The first bolt broke free with a high-pitched, tearing shriek of stressed metal. As the second bolt began to turn, a new sound permeated the air, not the music, but the low, viscous voice from the multi-fused entity, resonating through the closed vent. "You are damaging the instruments, Detective. We require them intact for the final performance." "Go to hell." Lee spat, firing a single round from her pistol into the vent, hoping to buy a moment. Jax wrestled with the third bolt. The thudding on the door was frantic now, the wood around the lock groaning and splitting dramatically. He got the third bolt open just as the wooden door finally exploded inward, showering them with splinters. The 4 figures staggered into the tiny room. Lee engaged immediately, emptying the rest of her magazine at the nearest entities, aiming for the joints and limbs, trying to disable them physically since bullets didn't seem to stop their advance. She managed to knock 2 to the ground, tangling them momentarily. Jax, ignoring the chaos, gave the final bolt one massive heave. It broke. "Done. Help me lift it." The manhole cover was impossibly heavy. They grabbed the rusted handle and strained, their muscles burning. The cover slowly lifted, revealing a gaping, dark hole and a deep, stale draft of air that smelled like wet stone and iron. Just as they were about to drop into the abyss, the 2 remaining entities lunged. One caught Lee by the arm, its fingers digging into her skin like rusty hooks. The other grabbed Jax's ankle. Lee screamed, but without hesitation, she swung the heavy manhole cover like a shield, slamming the sharp edge into the head of the creature holding her. The grip released. "Down. Now," she yelled, shoving Jax into the hole before dropping down herself, the last thing she saw being the 2 remaining entities scrambling, clawing at the edge of the opening. The manhole cover slammed shut above them with a violent, final clang. They were in total, crushing darkness, their flashlights having been dropped during the fall. Jax landed hard on Lee, who had managed to break their fall slightly on a pile of rubble. They were in a narrow, vertical ventilation shaft. The air was cold, damp, and utterly silent. The trill, the thudding, and the entity's voice, all were gone, muffled by the concrete above. "My light," Jax gasped, patting himself down. Lee found her light, miraculously intact, and flicked it on. The beam revealed they were standing on a narrow, unstable ledge halfway down the shaft. Below them, a ladder descended into a cavernous space, wherein the Sub-level, Lee whispered, consulting a mental map. The catacombs. Where they used to store medical waste and bodies during the original construction. As they began their precarious descent down the ladder, Lee pointed her light to the walls of the shaft. They weren't smooth concrete. They were lined with row upon row of small, square niches, each just large enough to hold a human skull. Most were empty, but a few held grim, yellowed relics. Then Jax heard it. Not the singing, not the voice, but the terrifying noise that had started it all, the one Lee had dismissed as plumbing. It was the hum. It was a deep, sustained vibration, a colossal bass note that wasn't just heard, but felt in the chest cavity, vibrating the dust from the walls. It felt like the entire mountain of the Pine Barrens was groaning in its sleep. The ladder ended on a damp, dirt floor. They were in a vast, cold cavern supported by ancient, crudely carved stone columns. Lee's light cut through the gloom, revealing stacks of rusted equipment and more skeletal remains. "The source is down here," Lee said, her voice barely audible over the thrumming hum. "This is the echo chamber the thing mentioned. The acoustics are amplifying whatever this sound is." She trained her beam on the largest stone column in the center of the cavern. It was covered in the same strange, dense symbols that Jax had seen on Isla's sheet music, hundreds of them, carved deep into the stone. The hum intensified, shaking the ground. Lee suddenly stopped and pointed to a massive fissure in the cavern floor, directly beneath the carved column. A thick, dark, oily liquid, the same substance Jax had seen leaking from the patient file, was bubbling up from the fissure, and submerged almost entirely in the viscous black liquid, was an object that made both officers freeze. A massive, obsidian-black resonator, a crude, metallic machine of interlocking tubes and plates. It was humming, vibrating violently, and feeding the colossal bass note into the earth. This wasn't an alarm system. It wasn't plumbing. This was an ancient, mechanical organ, and sitting on a rusted stool beside the machine, covered in the black oil, was the original entity, the multi-fused mass of pale flesh, its three heads still facing away, its attention fixed on the machine. Its visceral chest-mouth opened, and the sweet, terrible voice echoed, no longer booming from a vent, but directly through the physical space. "Welcome, detectives. The frequency modulator is complete. Now the whole forest will join the choir." The multi-fused entity, which Jax now mentally dubbed the Conductor, slid off the stool, the oily black liquid dripping from its pale, composite flesh. It towered over the obsidian resonator, its clawed hand resting on a dial embedded in the machine. "You came for the trigger," the Conductor said, the viscous voice oozing across the cavern. "You sought the source of the sound. And now you find it, a very old tuning fork, left behind by the truly great artists. We merely refined the melody." Lee and Jax stood amidst the rubble, the ground trembling violently beneath them from the immense hum generated by the resonator. The air was heavy, charged with ozone, and the strange, sweet floral scent was now overwhelming. "What is this thing?" Lee demanded, aiming her pistol, now uselessly empty, at the Conductor. She quickly transitioned to her taser, a last-ditch effort. The Conductor tilted its head mass, the three fused skulls twitching slightly. "It is a machine for resonance." Harrow Creek was built on a seam of compressed, resonating quartz, a natural amplifier. The old doctors tried to harness it to calm the patients. They believed the constant, low-frequency hum of the earth could induce deep tranquility. But they were amateurs. It tapped the dial on the resonator with its claw. "We discovered that the quartz resonates not with tranquility, but with terror. Human fear is a specific frequency, detective. A pure, sharp note of adrenaline and cortisol. Isla's voice provides the melody, the perfect soprano. This machine provides the bass and the volume." Jax felt a sudden, profound spike of anxiety, an irrational, sharp fear that was far beyond the terror of their current situation. It was cold, deep, and existential. He looked at Lee, whose face was pale and slick with sweat. "The fear, it's getting stronger," Jax whispered, clutching his chest. "It's not just an echo, Jax. It's amplification," Lee realized, her voice strained. "That oil, the symbols, they're focusing the resonance." "What did you do here?" The Conductor gestured with its pale arm toward the bubbling black liquid, the oily substance flowing from the fissure in the floor, bathing the resonator. patient 734, Isla Reichenbach, had the frequency. The others, the choir, they had the resonance. But the fear needed to be harvested. That black oil is the concentrated residual trauma of every soul that died here, every patient, every doctor, every despairing moment. We drain it, we refine it, and we feed it back into the machine. We are tuning the world to the key of pure dread. As the conductor spoke, the hum escalated into an agonizing screaming bass. The walls of the cavern began to weep, and the skulls in the niches shook violently. From the hole above them, they heard a muffled but distinct sound. The soprano voice of Isla Reichenbach was starting up again, high and impossibly clear, drilling through the air and blending with the bass hum. The sound was now a complex, beautiful, and utterly terrifying chord. The conductor turned the dial sharply. The first song has already begun. The full sound will spread across the Pine Barrens in minutes. Every creature, every home, every living thing within range will hear it. And their terror will become our fuel. Jax, fighting through a wave of overwhelming dread, looked around desperately. They couldn't fight the conductor with empty weapons, and they couldn't endure the sonic assault. They had to destroy the machine. His eyes landed on a box of old demolition equipment, corroded dynamite plungers and coils of wire, shoved against a far wall. Lee, seemingly reading his mind, pointed her taser at the conductor. Jax. The machine. I'll give you 30 seconds. 30 seconds to detonate ancient explosives in a structural nightmare? Got it. Jax muttered, forcing himself to move against the suffocating fear that screamed for him to simply curl up and weep. Lee fired the taser. The twin probes hit the conductor on its fused left shoulder. A violent surge of electricity surged through the creature. It convulsed, emitting a wet, screeching sound that was neither human nor mechanical, and momentarily released the dial. The sonic hum wavered, plunging the cavern into an agonizing, brief silence. Jax bolted for the explosives. The conductor recovered instantly, its chest mouth snapping open. Foolish girl. Electricity only makes the music sharper. It turned its attention from Lee to the resonator, its clawed hand moving to reset the dial. Lee grabbed the heavy pipe wrench Jax had used earlier and charged, slamming the wrench into the exposed side of the machine, aiming for the glowing wires. The metal shrieked. Sparks flew, and the resonator spat out a burst of sizzling, black oil. The hum dipped precariously low. Jax, hurry. I can't hold this. Lee yelled. Jax reached the demolition equipment. He grabbed 2 sticks of dynamite, brittle with age, and a single, ancient plunger. He raced back toward the resonator, even as the conductor roared in visceral fury and swung its massive claw at Lee. Lee ducked the blow but was knocked violently to the ground. She looked up just as the conductor's clawed hand settled back onto the machine's dial, locking it into place. The bass hum returned with a terrifying finality, and this time, it was joined by Isla's soprano in a perfectly harmonized chord that ripped at their sanity. The sound was so focused, so penetrating, that Jax felt the bones in his legs begin to vibrate painfully. He had to get the charge set, now. But the conductor was standing directly over the machine. You are too late, Officer Keller, the conductor whispered, its voice now laced with the music. The choir is ready to sing to the world. The horrifying frequency had been locked in. The colossal low roar from the resonator and the pure soprano of Isla Reichenbach fused into a supernatural harmony that shredded any sense of normal perception. Jax felt his knees tremble, not from fear, but because his bones themselves were vibrating apart. The conductor loomed over Lee, who was staggering as she tried to rise, one hand gripping the controls of the machine. Too late, Officer Keller, the conductor hissed, his voice drenched in music. The horror has been tuned. Now, we begin. He leaned forward, his grotesque chest mouth yawning open like a speaker horn, and a peal of laughter boomed out from within. At the same time, Isla's soprano from the floor above erupted, reaching an impossible, inhuman pitch. Jax knew that if this performance spread unchecked, it wouldn't just terrify people, it would drive them insane. He had one chance. Forcing himself to push past the pain and nausea caused by the frequencies, he grabbed the 2 antique sticks of dynamite, jammed them into the rusted, filthy housing of the resonator where Lee had struck it with her wrench, then set the old piston detonator on the floor. He tore a length of wiring from a nearby corroded coil and connected it to the blasting cap. Lee! Jax shouted, his voice cracking against the noise. Reverse frequency. Lee, bracing herself on one knee, stared at him, eyes filled with pain but still razor-sharp. What? The radio. In the car. There has to be a frequency that can break this resonance. Jax pointed at the hand held on her. It started with a shrieking voice. Find something like that. Something too loud and too wrong. Lee understood instantly. She dug into her coat and yanked out the handheld radio. She had tried calling for backup earlier, getting nothing but corrupted static. Now, she was going to turn that corruption into a weapon. The conductor was moving toward them, bony arm raised. No interference. This is our performance. Lee snapped the radio on, cranked the volume to maximum, and smashed it against a stone pillar, deliberately damaging its circuits. Instead of speech, it screamed, a piercing, twisted shriek of white noise, warped by the machine's own frequencies into a perfect howling feedback. That sound, no longer music, but pure chaos, slammed directly into Isla's flawless harmony and the resonator's tuned terror. The effect was immediate. The conductor roared in agony, not from any physical wound, but from the violation of his soundscape. The three skulls on his body whipped around violently. Silence it, the conductor howled, tearing his hand away from the resonator and clawing at the chest mouth. In that stolen instant, Jax moved. He wrapped his hand around the steel piston handle, crushing the fear inside his chest. Goodbye, he whispered, and slammed it down. Boom. A small, localized explosion went off, swallowed almost instantly by the monstrous hum. But it was enough. The feeble dynamite tore through the relic resonant components of the machine. The obsidian resonator gave a sickening crack. Black sparks spat outward. The slick black oil that had lubricated and amplified it ignited. The resonance collapsed at once. The great hum died, leaving behind a suffocating stillness, broken only by the fading shriek of the damaged radio. Without the resonance binding her, Isla Reichenbach's voice from above fractured into a scream of raw pain, as if her throat had been ripped away from the song. The conductor dropped to his knees. He didn't explode, instead, his connection to the machine was severed. He convulsed, and the chest mouth hacked up a stream of thick, black fluid. No. This cannot, that was not, the final note, he gurgled, his voice now a wet, shredded whisper. Despite her injuries, Lee drew the backup knife from her boot and hurled it into the chest mouth. The blade buried itself deep, and the conductor released one last, ragged shriek before going still. The black fluid poured out of him, merging with the burning oil spreading beneath the wrecked machine. What happened next was worse. The moment the conductor fell, the 4 isolation doors on the upper floor slammed shut in unison, their heavy bolts ramming into place. The last echoes of the sound died. It's done, Lee panted, forcing herself unsteadily to her feet. She stared at the fallen conductor, then up toward the ceiling where Isla and the others were once again sealed away. We've locked it in. All of them. They had fulfilled the black box's demand. They had ended the call. And they were still trapped. Their only potential exit was the vent above, and they had no way to reach it. Jax looked around. The vibrations had ceased, but the stench of molten metal and burning oil made his stomach lurch. He swept his flashlight over a narrow crack in the wall. The beam caught on a crumpled scrap of paper wedged deep inside. He pulled it free. It was a doctor's note from 1967, written in a hand far neater than Isla's records. Project terminated. Frequency too strong. Reserves must be sealed permanently, deep underground. If anyone attempts to access or reactivate the resonator, human survival is not guaranteed. Jax flipped the note over. On the back was a rough sketch of a sub-basement level, with an arrow pointing to the wall behind the resonator. Beneath the arrow, a scrawled line. Old sewer outlet. Lee and Jax turned toward the wall behind the ruined machine, where black fire licked up the stone. An exit, Lee said, her voice exhausted but resolute. Find something to pry it open. They had to get out. Before anything else woke up. The intense silence of the catacombs was broken only by the crackling of the dark oil fire licking the obsidian resonator and the heavy, ragged breathing of the two officers. The overwhelming sense of dread was gone, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion and a hollow, aching pressure behind Jax's eyes. Lee snatched the note from Jax's hand, confirming the crudely drawn map. The old sewage outflow. Built into the bedrock. It should lead out to the river, a few miles from here. The spot marked on the map was a heavy, circular metal plate set into the concrete wall behind the still-smoking resonator. They used the pipe wrench, the only tool they had left, to chip away the cement that had sealed the plate decades ago. "We have to move fast," Lee grunted, leaning heavily on the wrench. "The county is going to be swarming this place at sunrise, especially after that alarm tripped. We need a clean exit, and a story that makes sense." Jax worked beside her, fueled by pure survival instinct. "A story? We found a singing undead orchestra, a giant three-headed flesh monster, and a fear amplification machine fueled by trauma oil. What story makes sense, detective?" Lee paused, giving him a hard, level stare. Her face was smudged with soot and sweat, but her eyes were cold and focused. "The alarm tripped. We arrived. We found a highly volatile, leaking chemical storage room in the catacombs. We were forced to detonate an old, unsecured explosive charge to prevent a catastrophic collapse and chemical spill. No sign of personnel. No sign of life. We are injured. We are reporting structural damage and a biohazard. We do not report the choir." "You're covering it up," Jax realized, the shock of the past hour momentarily eclipsed by his partner's pragmatism. "I'm protecting the county, Jax. And more importantly, I'm protecting us," Lee corrected, emphasizing the word. "If you file a report about a multifused entity, they take your badge, your gun, and your sanity. If they believe us, they come back here with flamethrowers and bomb squads, and they might accidentally release something even worse than the choir director. We seal the story, just like we sealed those isolation cells." With a final, desperate wrench, the bolts sealing the old drainage plate groaned and snapped. The plate swung inward, revealing a dark, tight tunnel, an ancient sewer conduit that smelled faintly of stagnant water and earth. "After you, Officer Keller," Lee said, pushing him gently toward the hole. "Let's get out of the dark." They crawled into the narrow, dark tunnel, dragging themselves through the slick, cold mud and debris. The confinement was immediate and terrifying, but the silence was a blessed relief. They moved for what felt like hours, guided only by the distant, pale light of the moon filtering through the tunnel exit. Finally, they burst out onto the muddy banks of the Redwood River, several miles downstream from the sanitarium. The air was clean, damp, and smelled of pine and river water. It was 5:45 a.m. The sky was just beginning to lighten. Lee checked her comms. The jamming was gone. She pulled out her radio and, with a shaky voice, reported their situation. Excerpt from the official Redwood County Police Incident Report. Date, October 13, 2025. Time, 5:58 HRS. Location, Harrow Creek Sanitarium, abandoned, catacombs level. Unit, S, involved, 507, Detective Hansen, 509, off. Keller. Summary of findings. Units 507 and 509 responded to a Code 9 black box alarm. Investigation led to the discovery of an unsecured subterranean storage area containing highly unstable chemical compounds and antiquated, illegally stored detonation materials. The substances were leaking into the surrounding bedrock. Due to immediate danger of chemical explosion and structural collapse potentially affecting the county water table, Detective Hansen made the executive decision to neutralize the threat by detonating the old, volatile charges found on site, using controlled methods to minimize surface damage. The resulting controlled explosion stabilized the area but caused minor structural damage and injuries to both officers, severe hearing trauma and smoke inhalation. The area is now sealed. Recommendation: high-priority closure and investigation into illegal chemical storage. The site remains a severe biohazard. Hours later, after medical treatment and filing the report, Jax and Lee sat in the cold light of the precinct break room. Lee poured them both steaming mugs of black coffee. Jax's ears were still ringing, but he felt marginally more stable. "It's done," Lee said, her voice flat. "The sanitarium is closed. The truth is buried. They bought it." The chemical spill explanation. Jax nodded, taking a long sip of coffee. "And the creature? The conductor?" "The fire will take care of the body," Lee replied, looking down into her mug. "The heat will collapse the rest of the catacombs. We sealed the door. They'll be locked in their isolation cells forever. It's over." Jax looked at his partner, the only other person on Earth who knew what really happened. He noticed a small, dark stain on the collar of her uniform, near her neck. It was the same oily black substance. "Lee," Jax began slowly. "Are you sure it's over?" Lee looked up at him, her eyes dark and tired. "It has to be, Jax. We survived. We move on." She finished her coffee and stood up. "I'm taking a week off. You should too." As she walked toward the door, Jax noticed that she wasn't walking with her usual confident stride. Her movements were slightly too jerky, too measured, and then, just as she reached the exit, Lee stopped. She didn't turn around, but she raised her hand and brought her fingers to her lips, gently pressing them. Jax felt a sudden, sharp, chilling sense of pressure behind his eyes. He heard it too, faintly, briefly, a high, crystalline trill, a single, pure note that vibrated only in his skull. Lee lowered her hand and continued walking out. Jax was left alone in the break room, staring at the empty doorway, the phantom sound echoing in his mind. He realized that the conductor had said, "The first song has already begun." And the only person who knew the counter-frequency was gone. Jax didn't take the sick leave. He couldn't. The thought of being alone in his apartment, with the lingering tinnitus and the silent memory of the hum, was worse than the fluorescent lights of the precinct. He spent his days filing paperwork, the mundane task a fragile shield against the horror he had sealed away. Lee, however, was officially out for severe trauma and chemical inhalation. Jax tried calling her twice. The first time, she didn't answer. The second time, a deep, synthetic voicemail recording simply stated, "The singer is unavailable to receive your message. Please leave your frequency after the tone." He stopped calling. 3 days after the incident, the silence in the precinct was unnerving. The high-frequency pressure that had briefly returned when Lee left was gone, but Jax felt constantly on edge, like he was waiting for a phone call that would shatter his world. It was during the evening shift on day 4 that the first official, recorded anomaly occurred. Jax was monitoring the non-emergency dispatch channel when a call came in from an old farmer, Marcus Thorne, who lived miles from the sanitarium, deep in the Pine Barrens. "Dispatcher," the farmer's voice was tight with panic. "There's a sound. It's coming from my barn. The animals are going crazy. The damn thing is singing." "Sir, are you sure it's singing?" the dispatcher, a young woman named Sarah, asked skeptically. "Is it an animal noise? A bird?" "No. It's that damned sound," Thorne insisted, the panic spiking. "It's like 100 voices, high and sweet, but it makes my teeth ache. And my dog is scratching at the walls, trying to dig its way out." Sarah checked the logs. There were no concerts, no emergency broadcasts, and no reports of strange noises near the Pine Barrens. "Sir, I'm logging this as a nuisance complaint. Perhaps you should turn down your radio." "It's not the radio, you idiot. It's coming from the air. It's everywhere," Thorne screamed. The line abruptly cut off with a sound that was remarkably similar to the sudden, piercing tone that had initiated the black box call. Jax felt a surge of cold dread. He immediately pulled up the map and the location of Thorne's farm. He went to his supervisor, Lieutenant Graves, an aging officer with a permanent skepticism problem. "Lieutenant, I just monitored a call from Thorne's farm. He's reporting an extreme auditory anomaly, a high-pitched singing sound. It matches the preliminary description of the Harrow Creek incident." Graves didn't look up from his paperwork. "Keller, you just got back from a chemical explosion. You've got tinnitus and shell shock. Thorne is a known eccentric. It was probably a coyote. Log it and move on." the official report on Harrow Creek states the problem was contained. But, sir, the call ended with the exact same tone as the black box call, Jax insisted, feeling desperate. Are you suggesting the chemicals are singing, Officer Keller? Graves sighed, finally looking up with an expression of weary pity. Go home. Get some sleep. Jax knew there was no talking to him. The official story was ironclad that he couldn't shake the feeling. He drove to the storage locker where their personal effects from the Harrow Creek investigation were being held for evidence processing. He wasn't supposed to be there. He found the box marked 507 of 509 personal effects. Inside, he found Lee's items, her cracked radio, her bent pipe wrench, and a sealed plastic bag containing the small, water-damaged piece of sheet music from Isla Reichenbach's file. The music, the complex patterns of symbols, was the key. As he stared at the notes, Jax felt that familiar, subtle pressure behind his eyes. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but it was there, a low, rhythmic, distant pulse. It was the hum, but muted, somehow internal. He realized the horror hadn't been defeated, it had been absorbed. Suddenly, the lights in the storage room flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the lights snapped back on, Jax was standing alone, the sheet music clutched in his hand, but resting. Right beside the bag on the steel table, a new item had appeared, Detective Lee Hansen's official service handgun. The weapon she was required to keep on her at all times, and which she would never abandon. It was placed meticulously, perfectly centered, on the table, and etched deeply into the side of the metal casing of the pistol, where the grip met the barrel, was a single, tiny, freshly carved symbol, a swirling, complex notation that Jax recognized immediately. It was the first note from Isla Reichenbach's score. Lee hadn't gone on leave. She had returned the instrument of her duty, and she had left a message. She was either dead, or worse, she was following the score, and the siren's choir was tuning up. The sight of Lee's handgun and the carved musical notation was the confirmation Jax had dreaded. Lee hadn't simply left her weapon, she had delivered it. And the first note was not a random mark, it was a signature, a declaration that she was now part of the music. He quickly pocketed the sheet music and Lee's service weapon. Stealing evidence was a desperate move, but reporting this would lead only to a psychiatric hold. He was on his own. That night, Jax used his remaining sick time, telling the precinct he was taking the mandated rest. Instead, he drove the squad car, now his mobile command center, out to the edge of the Pine Barrens, parking on a desolate fire road a safe distance from the condemned sanitarium. He spread the water-stained sheet music across the dashboard, illuminated by his tactical flashlight. The symbols were densely packed, a terrifying roadmap of sound. He needed to understand the connection between the music and the map. He remembered the conductor's words, human fear is a specific frequency. Isla's voice provides the melody. He turned on the squad car's long-range radio scanner, tuning it through dozens of frequencies. He heard static, truckers, police chatter, and then, at the exact frequency that had carried the black box call, he heard a low, almost subliminal drone. It was the hum, filtered, distorted, but definitely present. Jax realized the sheet music wasn't just a composition, it was a frequency map. Each symbol likely corresponded to a location or a physical action that would amplify the sound. He looked at the first, complex symbol. He cross-referenced it with the coordinates of Marcus Thorne's farm, the farmer who reported the singing and the sudden cut-off. He drove to the farm. It was deserted. The barn was still, the air quiet. But inside, the walls were covered in deep scratch marks, and the smell of fear and ozone was faint but undeniable. The cattle and dogs were gone, likely having bolted into the woods. As he stood in the empty barn, staring at the scratches, Jax pulled out Lee's service pistol. The tiny, carved note felt cold under his thumb. He realized the creature's attack on the farm was just the beginning, a single, tuning note. He looked at the next symbol on the sheet music. It was larger, more complex, and drawn with a distinct, angular pattern. He matched the pattern to a local map. It pointed to the defunct Redwood County Clock Tower, an imposing granite structure in the center of the county seat. The clock tower was a historical landmark, famous for its massive brass bell, which rang out the time every hour. Why the clock tower? Jax raced back to the city. He arrived at the tower just before midnight. The streets were quiet. The town, nestled under the vast canopy of the Pine Barrens, was preparing for sleep. He scaled the rusted internal ladder of the tower, climbing past decades of cobwebs and pigeon nests. He reached the bell chamber, a cavernous space where the enormous, gleaming brass bell hung silent, awaiting the strike of midnight. He found Lee there. She was standing on the narrow walkway surrounding the bell, silhouetted against the Gothic arch window. She wore the same stained uniform, but her demeanor was utterly changed. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally bright, fixed on the bell. She held no weapon. "Lee," Jax whispered, climbing onto the platform. "What are you doing? We need to go." Lee didn't turn. Her voice was flat, emotionless, and resonated unervingly in the large stone chamber. "The score requires an impact note, Jax. Something heavy. Something metallic. Something to carry the frequency to the heart of the town." Jax looked down. He saw a pile of debris beside the bell mechanism, pieces of masonry, wood, and a large, heavy steel rod, the missing strike weight from the clock's pendulum. The second note wasn't a sound. It was an action. "You need to stop this, Lee," Jax pleaded, taking a cautious step toward her. "It's the machine. It's the oil. It's got inside your head." Lee finally turned. Her smile was distant and serene, the same disturbing, empty expression Isla Reichenbach had worn. And on the pale, exposed skin of her neck, just above the collar, Jax could see tiny, glistening lines, not scratches, but intricate, self-inflicted carvings that mirrored the symbols on the sheet music. "I'm merely the tuning mechanism, Jax," she said, her voice dropping to an almost singing whisper. "The conductor requires a new soprano. Isla is sealed. But I was the one who answered the call." She raised her hand. In it, she held a small, black object, the cracked, police-issue radio she had used to generate the counter-frequency in the catacombs. "I learned the music, Jax. And I'm ready for the next performance." Suddenly, the clock mechanism whirred, and the massive clock face outside began to chime its final warning. It was 11:59 p.m. Lee raised the steel strike rod high above her head. "The second note is a sharp, resonating in brass," she announced, her eyes glistening. Jax lunged for her, knowing that if she struck the bell with that frequency, the sound would shatter every mind in the downtown area, driving hundreds of people into panic and violence, fully charging the conductor's twisted energy field. Jax roared and lunged across the narrow platform. Lee, despite her altered state, moved with impossible speed, fueled by the terrifying, focused intent of the score. As the clock outside chimed the final, warning tick before midnight, Lee brought the heavy steel strike rod down. Clang. The massive brass bell exploded with a deafening, visceral, a sharp note that wasn't merely loud. It was an impact wave that struck Jax with the force of a physical blow. The stone floor vibrated violently, and Jax was thrown backward against the cold granite wall. His ears screamed, and his vision flashed white. This was not just a sound, it was the amplification the conductor had spoken of. The specific frequency, carried by the massive metal bell, was being broadcast across the city. Lee didn't pause. The ringing bell seemed to be resonating through her. She dropped the rod and turned, her eyes fixed on Jax, her face showing a chilling mixture of serenity and determination. "The resonance is set," she whispered, her voice an eerie overlay on the ringing brass. "The citizens are listening. The final score requires a sacrifice." She reached to the narrow platform railing and effortlessly climbed over it, balancing precariously on the ledge overlooking the 300-foot drop to the street below. Jax scrambled to his feet, fighting the crippling sonic disorientation. He knew the sacrifice wasn't just her life, it was the final, devastating note needed to fully open the connection between the conductor and the outside world. "Lee! Stop!" he yelled, lunging again. Lee looked down at the street, a beatific, insane smile on her face. "The final act is always the purest note, Jax. It completes the call." As she prepared to leap, Jax had a flash of inspiration. He ignored her and lunged for the source of the sound, the massive, vibrating brass bell. He grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher he had carried up the stairs and slammed it into the side of the bell. The clang didn't stop the ringing, but the aluminum shell of the extinguisher shattered, spraying a cloud of dry, chemical powder across the brass. The powder settled instantly on the bell's surface, dampening the vibration and distorting the perfect, resonant pitch, the A-sharp note immediately sputtered and died, replaced by a grating, chaotic scrape of metal against stone. As the bell's vibration fought the powder, the change in frequency was instant and debilitating. Lee screamed, a sound of pure, physical agony, and stumbled backward off the ledge, falling onto the platform. The serenity was gone, replaced by confusion and pain. The carved symbols on her neck seemed to pulse. Jax dropped the extinguisher and rushed to her side. Lee was clutching her head, rocking back and forth. The frequency, the purity, you broke the chord, she gasped, her voice Lee's again, raw and desperate. It's not your voice, Lee. It's the oil, it's the machine. Jax said, grabbing her shoulders. It's using you to finish the hum. He knew he couldn't take her back to the precinct like this. He couldn't lock her up. The conductor was using her as a tuning fork. That he looked at the sheet music in his pocket. He had one chance to use the choir's own rules against them. Jax pulled out his taser. I need you to fight the music, Lee. Just for a second. I need you to break the internal rhythm. Lee looked at him, her eyes flicking between the clear, desperate plea of her partner and the blank, serene gaze of the possessed. I can't, the music, it's too deep, the conductor said. Electricity made the music sharper, Jax reminded her, his voice low and urgent. Let's make it so sharp, it breaks the score. He pressed the taser against the fresh, tiny carvings on her neck, the score etched onto her skin. That he hesitated for a second, then slammed the button. Lee arched her back, a wet, guttural scream tearing from her throat as the electricity surged through the fragile frequency nodes. The skin around the carvings darkened instantly. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Jax felt the high-frequency pressure in his own head spike to an unbearable level. He heard a chorus of distant screams, not the siren choir, but human screams, from the direction of the Pine Barrens. As the distorted energy bounced off the forest, the surge broke the connection. Lee collapsed, unconscious, her body now slack and heavy. The manic glow in her eyes was extinguished. Jax gently laid her down. He was shaking, the ringing in his ears now a permanent companion. He looked down at the sheet music clutched in his hand. The complex symbols of the final movement, the sacrifice, were suddenly replaced by a single, bold, terrifying word, finale. That he looked out the window. Down in the darkness of the Pine Barrens, a vast, pale light was beginning to shine, pulsing to the rhythm of the shattered, erratic sound waves. It was the energy discharge from the sanitarium, the climax of the unfinished song. The conductor was still active. And it was attempting to finish the symphony of fear without its soprano. Jax carefully secured Lee to the central granite support of the bell tower with his belt and a length of wire he'd salvaged. She was breathing, but deeply unconscious. He retrieved the sheet music, his hands shaking violently from adrenaline and the remnants of the sonic blast. The final word, finale, blazed on the page. That he looked down at the pale, throbbing light emanating from the center of the Pine Barrens, miles away. The light pulsed, erratic and unstable, like a massive, struggling heart. The explosion of the resonator in the catacombs had wounded the conductor, but the creature was now attempting to use the natural resonance of the quartz seam and the raw energy of the choir to complete its task, flooding the region with a cataclysmic wave of fear. The music had to be killed at its source. Jax grabbed the damaged, dry chemical fire extinguisher he had used to disable the bell. It was mostly empty, but he needed the shell. He raced down the stairs, ignoring the pain in his knees and the ringing in his ears. That he jumped into the squad car and drove, sirens wailing, not for warning, but to drown out the low, residual drone that still permeated the night air. He drove straight off the fire road, slamming through undergrowth and snapping branches, straight back towards Harrow Creek. When he reached the perimeter of the sanitarium grounds, the pulsing pale light was blinding. It wasn't emanating from the building, but from the earth itself, specifically from the fissure where the resonator had been. The ground around the light was shimmering, vibrating violently, and the air was thick with the ozone and the sickly, sweet scent. Jax stopped the car. He looked at the sheet music one last time. He had to assume the final note was a physical counter-frequency, a final disruption of the core source. That he took the damaged fire extinguisher shell, its contents mostly spent, and forced open the narrow end. He grabbed a handful of the finest, driest sand he could find from the roadside and carefully poured it into the canister, creating a crude, makeshift sand bomb that he then took Lee's service weapon and his own, both empty, and jammed them into the sand. He taped the opening shut with duct tape from the trunk. It was a desperate, nonsensical plan, a heavy, dense, sand-filled projectile that he sprinted toward the light. The closer he got, the stronger the sound became, no longer music, but a chaotic, grinding cacophony of noise, the deep bass hum, the strained soprano of Isla, and the terrified cries of the remaining trapped choir members, all fighting for dominance. Jax reached the crumbling edge of the catacomb entrance, the area where the drainage pipe had connected. The original black box alarm panel was still there, fused to the wall, flickering rapidly. He raised the heavy, improvised sand bomb. He had to get it into the fissure, directly onto the remains of the resonator, to physically damp the sound source before the final wave of fear was released. Suddenly, a massive, pale hand shot out from the shadows near the fissure. It was the conductor, its fused body barely visible, covered in soot and charred oil, crawling towards the light. Its chest mouth was a gaping, dark hole. The finale is pure release. The conductor shrieked, its voice broken and raw. You cannot stop the frequency. It is the sound of everything. The creature's clawed hand snatched at Jax's ankle. Jax stumbled, dropping the heavy shell. It rolled toward the pulsating fissure. The conductor lunged forward, trying to grab the shell. To protect the source, Jax acted on instinct. He delivered a brutal, desperate kick to the creature's chest mouth, the only vulnerability he had identified. The kick connected with a wet slap. The creature screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure physical injury, and momentarily recoiled. That second was all Jax needed. He scrambled forward, grabbed the shell, and with a final, massive heave, threw the sand-filled canister straight into the pulsing, pale light of the fissure. The heavy, dense mass of the shell impacted the shattered remains of the resonator deep within the quartz seam. The sand immediately sprayed and poured out, filling every crack and exposed crystal. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The light died, the chaos of sound collapsed, the colossal bass hum, the soprano trill, the grinding cacophony. It all vanished, replaced by a sudden, total, deafening silence. The ozone dissipated. The sweet, floral scent was gone. The ground stopped shaking. The conductor let out a final, guttural weep, a sound of profound, final despair, before its entire fused mass simply dissolved, melting into a puddle of black, harmless oil that seeped back into the cold earth. Jax stood alone in the absolute silence, his body shivering, staring into the dark, quiet hole. He had broken the score. He had ended the call. Epilogue. Weeks later, the official investigation concluded that the Harrow Creek Sanitarium was structurally unsound due to internal chemical damage and had partially collapsed, burying the sublevels entirely. The incident was classified as a contained environmental disaster. Detective Lena Hansen was discharged with full honors and a commendation for bravery. The notes on her neck were listed as severe chemical burns. Jax visited Lee in the hospital. She was calm, quiet, and completely Lee again. I remember the music, she whispered, her voice still rough. It was beautiful, Jax. The most perfect, terrifying thing I've ever heard. It told me exactly what to do. It's over, Lee, Jax insisted. The source is buried. The score is destroyed. Lee smiled sadly. The score is never destroyed, Jax. It's a memory. And the only way the conductor ever truly gets its finale is if we tell the truth. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small, old, microcassette recorder, the kind used for interviews.